This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Churchill. Churchill was released in 2015 by GMT Games and designed by Mark Herman. This game supports from 1 to 3 players and takes from 1 to 5 hours to play. Churchill is a political war game where each player assumes the role of one of the big 3 Allied leaders during World War II. In this game, leaders debate issues to win resources to advance their respective military fronts versus the Axis in the Europe and Pacific theaters. While winning World War II is the primary objective, each leader is also attempting to best position his nation politically for the post-war world. The progress towards these various objectives are awarded victory points, which will ultimately determine the winner of the game. Before we jump back into the playthrough, let's cover off on the basics of advancing and debating issues. The agenda segment, which we covered in the last video, shows how players nominate issues to be discussed during the conference. All issues, with the exception of the first issue, begin at the center of the conference table. This tutorial mainly covers the meeting segment. In the meeting segment, players can use their team of 7 randomly drawn staff cards and their 1 leader card to attempt to win issues. The number in the corner of the staff card indicates the strength of the negotiator and the number of spaces an issue can be moved on the board. Issues are considered won if the issue marker rests on the nation's track at the end of the conference. Issues advanced all the way to the leader's chair are considered permanently won no matter when that happens during the conference. Certain issues must remain at the center of the table to activate, which represents all players agreeing on that issue. Circling the conference table, each player takes a turn, starting with the player to the left of the one that won the first issue. Each turn, a player chooses which issue he or she wants to advance and plays a staff card. The issue then moves that number of spaces towards their chair. Next, following the order of play, the other 2 players have the option to debate the issue. To debate the issue, the opposing player plays a staff card and moves the issue back towards their own track, the number of spaces according to their staff card strength. As an added incentive to debate, a player also receives a pass marker that they can spend to pass rather than play a card when it's their turn. During their turn, a player may also play a staff card and then dismiss that staff member to play their leader card instead. When the leader takes the stage, you only use their abilities, and not the abilities of the staff member they replaced. Once the leader's special attribute and health penalty is resolved, move the leader block on the chair space to show the inactive text and hide the active text. Be aware of a leader's active or inactive status, as it may have an impact on staff abilities during the conference. Now that we're grounded with the basics of advancing and debating issues, let's continue on with the meeting segment of the game. Beginning the meeting segment, the Stalin player is up, and they get to choose an issue they'd like to progress towards their chair. The Soviet player chooses the Pole Mill 1-3 issue. Next, they need to select a card from their hand that will speak for this issue. They choose Vsevolod Merkelov, who has a strength of 1, but adds a +1 when negotiating a Pole Mill issue. By playing the card, Merkelov says his piece about the issue, and now the American and British player have the option to debate it. Essentially, if either of these players place a card, it will push the issue back towards their own chair, based on their card's negotiation strength. As it turns out, neither player wants to debate this particular issue, and it moves forward 2 spaces towards Stalin's chair unopposed. However, we're not done with Comrade Merkelov, who is a Commissar of State Security, essentially the NKVD. He can potentially penalize the Russian player with his Gulag trait. When the next Soviet card is played, the Russian player will need to roll a 6-sided die. On a result of 1, that speaker will be arrested and removed from the conference. So let's leave the Merkelov card out as a reminder. Next, it's the Americans' turn, and the American player wants to push the issue on the USSR-directed offensive. To speak for this issue, Stanley Embrick, who has a strength of 1, but adds 2 to this because this is a directed offensive. Therefore, he's able to move the issue 3 spaces. While the British player does not object, the Russian player decides to debate this issue and sends in Semyon Budyani. Budyani is a very strong speaker with a strength of 5. Plus, the Russian national attribute is that they are strong debaters with their Niet ability, which gives the speaker a +1. As a result, this 5 is increased to 6. Normally, this would move the issue back towards Stalin's chair by 6 spaces. Unfortunately, Stalin is active, and this is a weakness of Budyani, who loses 2 strength. As a result, he can only debate the issue back 4 spaces, but this is enough to put it on the Soviet track. To complicate matters even further for Budyani, now he must roll a die to avoid being sent to the Gulag by Merkelov. Fortunately for him, he ends up rolling a 3 and is successful in avoiding this fate. Now, because Stalin chose to debate, this gives him the option to pass or play on his next turn. To remind ourselves, we're going to place a marker on his chair. Next up in the order of play is the British player, who decides to push the issue of leadership in the European theater with Admiral Cunningham. Cunningham has a strength of 2, but adds 2 to this when used for the European leadership issue. Therefore, the European leadership issue moves forward 4 spaces towards Churchill's chair. The Soviets and the Americans decide not to debate the issue, and the turn passes to the Soviet player. The Russian player decides to make use of their pass that they won by debating earlier, and we remove the reminder marker. Now we're back to the American player. The American player brings out William Donovan, who has a negotiation strength of 2 and an additional +3 for Paul Mill issues. Naturally, the American decides to use Donovan to pull back the Paul Mill 1-3 issue from the Soviet track. Neither the British nor the Soviets decide to debate this. After this, it's the British player's turn, and they decide to play Sir Charles Portal. Portal only has a strength of 1, but adds a 2 to this if the issue is on the US track. Therefore, the British player brings up the Paul Mill 1/3 issue again and brings it back to the center space. The Russians decline the option to debate. The Americans, however, want to debate and play the Frank C. Walker card, and then immediately announce that Roosevelt is going to take his place and speak. Now, you might remember that Roosevelt is not actually present, but it's assumed he can intervene via correspondence. Roosevelt's negotiation strength of 7 moves the issue all the way to his chair, and the Americans have permanently won this issue. However, writing this letter was apparently so taxing that Roosevelt must now roll 2 6-sided die to see whether or not he dies. Luckily, the dice result is a 5, and Roosevelt survives the ordeal. Now that Roosevelt has been played, move his block down to cover up the active banner on his chair and reveal the inactive banner. The Americans also receive a pass marker for debating. Next up is the Soviets, who play Vyacheslav Molotov to advance the global issue from the center of the conference table to the 6th space on the Soviet track. The Americans decline their opportunity to debate. However, the British plan to debate and put forward Sir Dudley Pound, who is obviously no match for Molotov. Not only that, but he has health issues, so we now need to roll a 6-sided die. On a die result of 1 to 3, Pound dies. I swear, these British need to lay off the butter. The die result is a 6, so Pound lives. Then the British announce that Pound is stepping aside and Churchill himself will speak instead. Churchill's intervention pulls the global issue all the way out of the Soviet track and places it on the 1 space in the UK track. And since this is the global issue, Churchill earns 1 political alignment marker as well. However, the strain of this monumental effort triggers a heart attack. Now we must roll 2d6, a literal die result, to save Churchill. And the result is a 9, and Churchill lives to drink another day. Now that we've finished playing Churchill, we move his marker down to cover up the active bar on his photo. The British also receive a pass marker for debating. Next is the American player, who is debated and decides to pass. We switch over to the British player, who also decides to pass. Now we're back to the Soviets, who decide to play Georgy Malenkov and then switch him out to play Stalin. Stalin chooses to grab the 2-2 issue and drag it back to his track, and he's able to place it on the 5 space. Stalin receives a clandestine network marker for his effort, but also, since he's been played, it's time to make a die roll to see if his paranoia is triggered. Fortunately, the Soviet player rolls a 7 and Stalin does not have an episode. Now that we've used Stalin, we move his marker to cover up the active bar and reveal the inactive bar on his picture. Then it's the American player's turn. The American player puts Henry Morgenthau into play and re-engages the global issue, and moves it back toward the American track 5 spaces so it ends up in the 4 space. The British decline to debate, but the Soviets send in Nikolai Kuznetsov to debate the issue. Kuznetsov moves the world issue from the American 4 space back to the Soviet 1 space. Kuznetsov's attribute also provides the Soviets with a naval marker in the Arctic theater box. The Russians also receive a pass marker for debating. Next, it's the British player's turn, and they put in Clement Attlee to bring up the global issue again. This moves the global issue to the UK's 4 space. A quick note, Attlee usually has a -2 to his strength if Churchill is active, but since we've already played Churchill, he is not impacted by this weakness. The Soviet player decides to debate the issue with their last card and sends in Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov is a chief with a star in the corner of his card, so we roll a 6-sided die to determine his negotiating strength. The die result is a 3. Add a 1 to this for the Soviet Niet national characteristic for a total of 4. This amount is not enough to overcome Attlee's 5 strength. This will move the global issue back to the center space. Next, it's the Americans' turn. The Americans play Avril Harriman and use his 4 strength plus 1 for issues on the Soviet track to advance the USSR directive offensive. This issue moves to the American track's 4 space. The UK chooses not to debate this, and the Soviets cannot debate because they're now out of cards. The UK then takes their turn. They play Ernest Blevin to bring up the 2-2 Pole Mill issue. Blevin has an impressive 5 strength, but is weakened by 1 due to having to talk to a Pole Mill issue on the Soviet track. Therefore, he is only able to move it back to the Soviet 1 space. The Soviets are out of cards, so they can't debate, and the Americans choose not to debate. Next, it's the Soviets' turn, but they're out of cards, so it's back to the Americans again. The Americans play Harry Hopkins. Hopkins goes for the global issue again and moves it to the American 5 space. The UK doesn't debate, and Stalin is out of cards, so he can't debate. Finally, it's the British player's turn. The British play Stuart Menzies. Menzies has a strong pole mill issue strength, but cannot use it to the British's advantage. Therefore, the player uses Menzies to advance the US production issue to the UK's 1 space. And with that, the conference is over. Now let's take a look at the issues that each allied nation have won in this conference. The conference is over, so let's discuss how many issues each allied nation won. The United Kingdom won U.S. production and European theater leadership. The Americans won the Pole Mill 1-3 issue, the USSR directed offense, and the global issue. And the Soviets won the Pole Mill 2-2 issue. Since the Americans won the most issues, they win the conference and receive 3 victory points. There were also a number of additional bonuses won by using particular cards. The UK won a political alignment marker for using Churchill in the right situation, and the Soviets won a clandestine network marker for using Stalin, as well as a naval support marker for the Arctic theater for using Kuznetsov. Keep these additional wins in mind when moving to the military display in the next phase. A quick note about victory point tracking. It is entirely up to the players when they track the victory points. Calculating and moving markers does take time, so many opt to figure out the victory point score at the end of the game. I've added the 3 points to the American player here, but it's up to you and your game group how you want to handle this. The last segment of the conference phase is the decision segment. The decision segment is about putting the issues that were just won into action. This segment is comprised of a list of 7 steps that essentially prioritizes which issues players need to resolve first. In step 1, players that want a directive offensive issue place that issue on the appropriate front box they wish that nation to take action in. In our example conference, the Americans won the USSR directed offensive. Therefore, they can place that marker in one of the Soviets' theater boxes to direct the Soviets to put effort there. In step 2, conditional issues are resolved. Conditional issues refer to the special fronts in each theater. The second front, and the USSR declares war on Japan. Step 3 is for determining production. In this phase, each player organizes the number of production markers they have won or lost. For example, in our conference, the British won a production marker from the US. And in step 4, production allocation, each player will then spend his or her production markers to prepare for the war phase. Another bonus of winning the conference is that the Americans get to allocate their production last. Therefore, they can watch the other players spend their production before committing their own. Step 5 is the check theater leadership. In this step, adjust the theater leadership in each map display if the issue has been won. Since the British won leadership of the European theater, update that section on the map. The British will also receive their choice of 2 offensive support markers or 2 naval support markers. Step 6 is for A-bomb research. If this issue is won, then roll dice and adjust the research and spy ring pawns on the board. And finally, step 7, global issue. Since the Americans won the global issue, they can now adjust one of their 2 pawns closer to their chair. One pawn is situated between their chair and the British, and the other between their chair and the Soviets. This will provide an advantage when dealing with either of these powers during the game. Once the players have completed this decision checklist, the conference phase is over. From there, proceed to the war phase, which deals exclusively with the military display. We covered this display in great deal in the second tutorial. Essentially, you will follow a checklist of segments. First, resolve the placement of the clandestine network markers, then the stronger political alignment markers, and finally, with the military segment, you will place Axis reserve cubes and attempt to move the various fronts on the board. Naturally, when this is completed, everything repeats itself with a new conference. Once you've completed all the required conferences, or both Axis powers have surrendered, it's time to determine a winner. Tabulating victory points aside, there are 2 objectives to the game: defeat the Axis powers and end World War II, and in the post-war world, build an alliance that will preserve the balance of power for the future. It's best to think of these in-game scenarios as 3 possible timelines. In the first timeline, the one we accept now as reality, the Allies defeated the Axis, and although a Cold War followed, no power was great enough to upset the political balance and trigger another world war. This is recognized by the players' scores being within 20 victory points of each other. In the second timeline, the Axis are defeated as well, but one Allied nation's power in the post-war world is far too great. This results in a fractured alliance. Essentially, this sets up a future where World War III is inevitable. From a point perspective, this means that the first place score is greater than the third place score by 20 or more victory points. If the first place score is greater than the score of the combined score of the remaining players, the first player wins. Otherwise, the second player wins. But ultimately, I think we know that nobody really wins. The third timeline is equally grim, as the Allies were unsuccessful in beating the Axis powers. This results in the possibility of yet another European conflict of some kind, as there is no stability in the world. When this happens from a point perspective, each player takes their total and adjusts the score. First place loses 5 victory points, second place loses 3 victory points, and last place gains 5 victory points. Once again, I don't think this particular outcome is something for any player to be proud of. Looking at these 3 outcomes, you can understand why Mark Herman has called this a game of coopetition. Cooperate with your allies to win World War II and ensure your particular nation is on top, but not to an extent that it destroys the future. I hope you've enjoyed learning Churchill, a board game by Mark Herman, published by GMT Games. If you've watched these tutorial episodes, you and your friends should be ready now to begin your own game of Churchill. And I look forward to hearing about your political and military exploits in the comments section. Questions about this game, requests for future Harsh Rules game tutorials, and constructive feedback are all greatly appreciated. Drop a line in the comments section. To be the first notified when this episode and any Harsh Rules episode is placed online, please subscribe to this channel. Until then, I'm Ben Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.